The blizzard had turned the mountain road into a death trap, and Emma Carter knew she was going to die out here. Her rental car sat buried up to its windows in a snowdrift, engine dead, heat gone for the past hour. The GPS had stopped working. 20 miles back, and her cell phone showed nothing but no service in the corner of a rapidly dimming screen. She pulled her thin city coat tighter around her shoulders, knowing it was useless against the Colorado mountain cold that was already seeping into her bones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She should have listened to the warnings. The clerk at the Denver airport rental desk had shaken his head when she'd insisted on driving to Pine Ridge in November. The weather reports had been clear about the incoming storm, but Emma had been determined to reach David's mining claim before winter fully set in, to finally understand what had drawn her husband to this godforsaken wilderness in the months before his sudden heart attack. Now she understood why David had never brought her here. This place was trying to kill her. The wind howled against the car with a fury that seemed personal, rocking the small sedan like a toy. Snow piled against the windshield faster than the useless wipers could clear it. Emma fumbled in her purse for her phone again, desperately hoping for even one bar of signal. Nothing. The battery was down to 15% anyway. She had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia set in, less if she couldn't find some way to stay warm. Through the wide-out chaos outside her windows, a shadow moved. Emma's heart hammered as the dark shape approached her car, massive and indistinct through the swirling snow. For a terrifying moment, she thought it might be a bear. Then the shadow took human form, a tall figure in heavy winter gear appearing at her driver's side window like something out of a nightmare or a miracle. The man gestured for her to roll down the window. Emma hesitated, city instincts warring with desperation. The figure stepped back and pulled off his hood, revealing a weathered face framed by dark hair streaked with silver, intense blue eyes that seemed to see everything at once. He looked like he belonged out here, like the storm was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Your car's not going anywhere," he called over the wind, his voice rough from disuse. "You need to come with me now, or you'll freeze to death in there." Emma stared at him through the glass. Everything about this situation screamed danger. Strange man, isolated location, no one knowing where she was. But the alternative was sitting here until the cold claimed her, and she could already feel her fingers going numb despite her gloves. "Who are you?" she shouted back, though she doubted he could hear her clearly through the glass and wind. The man stepped closer, his breath visible in white puffs. "Name's Jake Sullivan. I live about a mile from here. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better. We need to move now." Something in his tone, urgent but not threatening, made Emma's decision for her. She grabbed her purse and the small overnight bag from the passenger seat, then pushed open the car door against the wind's resistance. The cold hit her like a physical blow, so intense it took her breath away. Snow immediately began accumulating on her inadequate jacket. Jake reached for her bags without asking, slinging them over his shoulder with practiced efficiency. "Stay close," he instructed, already moving away from the car. "The trail's not far, but it's easy to get lost in this." Emma stumbled after him, her city shoes finding no purchase on the snow-covered ground. Within 10 steps, she was already falling behind, her lungs burning from the thin mountain air and freezing wind. Jake noticed immediately, turning back to offer his arm for support. "Lean on me," he said simply. "Trail's rough even in good weather." Emma hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. His arm was solid and steady beneath her grip, and she was grateful for both the physical support and the human contact. They moved through the storm like ghosts, Jake navigating by landmarks Emma couldn't even see through the whiteout. Trees loomed out of the snow like sentinels, and more than once she would have walked straight into one without his guidance. The trail he led her on wasn't really a trail at all, more like a path that existed only in Jake's memory. They climbed steadily upward, the snow sometimes reaching Emma's knees. Her legs burned with the effort, and her lungs felt like they were on fire, but Jake's pace never wavered. He moved through this treacherous terrain like he could walk it blindfolded, which Emma suspected he probably could. "How much farther?" she gasped after what felt like an eternity of struggle. "Just ahead," Jake replied, and for the first time Emma heard something like warmth in his voice. You're doing better than most city folks would." Emma wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation, but she held on to it anyway. Her whole body was shaking now, whether from cold or exhaustion she couldn't tell. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, a structure materialized out of the storm ahead of them. It was a cabin, but calling it that seemed insufficient. The building was substantial and well-crafted, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and careful construction. Warm yellow light glowed from windows that had been cut with precision, and smoke rose from a stone chimney that looked like it could withstand anything nature threw at it. This wasn't some rough mountain shack. Someone had built this place to last, to be a real home in the wilderness. Jake led her up onto a covered porch that wrapped around the front of the cabin, offering blessed relief from the wind. He stamped snow off his boots and gestured for Emma to do the same before opening a heavy wooden door that moved silently on well-maintained hinges. The warmth hit Emma like a wave as she stepped inside, so intense after the brutal cold that she actually staggered. The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than the outside. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind a screen that cast dancing shadows across log walls that had been sanded smooth and sealed to a warm honey color. The furniture was clearly handmade but showed real craftsmanship, sturdy chairs and tables that fit the space perfectly. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with what looked like hundreds of volumes. This wasn't the home of some hermit hiding from civilization. This was the retreat of someone who had chosen solitude deliberately and made it beautiful. "Sit by the fire," Jake instructed, already moving toward what Emma could see was a well-equipped kitchen area. "I'll get coffee started. You need to warm up from the inside out." Emma sank into a chair positioned near the fireplace, finally allowing herself to believe she was going to survive. The warmth began to penetrate her chilled body, bringing with it the painful tingling that meant her circulation was returning. She watched Jake move around his kitchen with economical efficiency, filling a kettle from a hand pump at what appeared to be a genuine well, measuring coffee with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from breathing the cold air. "You saved my life out there." Jake glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "Storm caught you unprepared. Happens to a lot of people who don't know the mountains." There was no judgment in his tone, but Emma felt defensive anyway. "I'm not completely helpless. I just didn't expect it to get this bad this fast." "Weather changes quick up here," Jake agreed, setting the kettle on what she now realized was a wood-burning stove. Forecast said possible snow flurries. Turned into a full blizzard in about an hour. Emma looked around the cabin again, taking in details she'd missed in her initial relief at being warm and safe. Everything here showed the touch of someone who worked with his hands, who understood both function and beauty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The logs were fitted together with joints so precise they looked machine-made. The stone work around the fireplace showed the kind of skill that took years to develop. Even the simple wooden chairs she was sitting in had been crafted with an attention to detail that spoke of someone who took pride in his work. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. Jake nodded, not looking up from preparing the coffee. "Took about 3 years to get it the way I wanted it." 3 years. Emma tried to imagine spending 3 years building a home in complete isolation, working alone to create something this substantial and beautiful. The level of planning and skill required was staggering, but even more impressive was the dedication it would have taken to see such a project through without anyone to help or encourage the work. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. Jake was quiet for so long Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. 20 years, give or take. 20 years. Emma stared at him, trying to process that information. Jake looked to be in his mid-40s, which meant he'd come to this mountain as a young man and simply never left. Never gone back to whatever life he'd had before. She wanted to ask why, what had driven him to such complete isolation, but something in his posture warned her away from the question. The kettle began to whistle, and Jake poured hot water over coffee grounds in a simple metal pot. The smell filled the cabin, rich and comforting. He brought her a mug made from what looked like hand-thrown pottery, the ceramic warm against her still-cold fingers. "This is incredible," Emma said after taking a sip. The coffee was perfectly brewed, strong without being bitter. Where did you learn to make coffee like this? Practice, Jake replied, settling into another chair across from her with his own mug. When you make coffee every day for 20 years, you figure out how to do it right. Emma studied his face in the firelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow, the calluses on his hands that testified to constant physical work, the way he held himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to depend entirely on himself. There was something almost otherworldly about him, as if he existed outside normal time and social conventions. What were you doing out in the storm? She asked. How did you find me? Jake's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. I was checking my weather equipment. Storm was worse than expected, and I wanted to make sure everything was secured properly. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Heard your car engine struggling from about a quarter-mile away. Sound carries different in snow, and that engine was working too hard for the conditions. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You mean you came out looking for me? In that blizzard? Couldn't leave someone stranded, Jake said simply, as if risking his life for a complete stranger was the most natural thing in the world. The casual heroism of it left Emma speechless. This man had heard a car in distress and immediately ventured out into a storm that could easily have killed him, with no idea who he might find or whether they deserved rescue. After 20 years of isolation, his first instinct had still been to help. I don't know how to thank you, Emma said finally. Jake shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. Storm should pass by morning. I can help you dig out your car. Then, see if it'll start. Emma realized she hadn't even thought about her car since reaching the cabin. The warmth and safety had made everything else seem distant and unimportant. But Jake was right. Eventually, she would need to get back to civilization, back to the business that had brought her to Colorado in the first place. I was trying to reach Pine Ridge, she said. My husband owns some land up there. A mining claim. Jake's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. Mining claim? Which one? Eagles Point, I think it was called. David bought it about 6 months ago. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it now that he's gone. Something shifted in Jake's expression, a recognition that made Emma's pulse quicken. You're David Carter's wife. It wasn't a question. Emma stared at him, wondering how this isolated mountain man could possibly know her late husband's name. You knew David? Jake stood abruptly, moving to stoke the fire with more intensity than it required. He came by here a few times. Asked questions about the area, the terrain around his claim. Emma felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her. David had never mentioned meeting anyone during his trips to Colorado, had always described his time here as completely solitary. Yet this man clearly knew him, had spoken with him multiple times. What kind of questions? Emma asked. Jake remained, focused on the fire, his back to her. Geological stuff mostly. Wanted to know about water sources, soil composition, whether I thought his claim had potential. And what did you tell him? Jake finally turned back to face her, and Emma saw something guarded in his expression. Told him the truth. That land's been picked over for decades. Whatever gold might have been there originally is long gone. Emma felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest. David had spent thousands of dollars on that mining claim, money they couldn't really afford, insisting it was an investment in their future. She'd assumed it was some kind of midlife crisis, a romantic notion about striking it rich in the mountains. But if Jake was right, if David had known the claim was worthless, then why had he bought it? He bought it anyway, Emma said, more to herself than to Jake. People do strange things when they're looking for something, Jake observed quietly. The cryptic comment made Emma look at him more closely. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with looking for things that couldn't be found. She wondered what had driven him to this mountain 20 years ago, what he might have been seeking in this beautiful isolation. What about you? She asked impulsively. What brought you here? Jake's expression closed off immediately, the brief moment of openness disappearing behind walls that looked well practiced. Getting late, he said instead of answering. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Emma recognized the deflection for what it was, but she was too tired to push. The warmth of the cabin, the stress of nearly dying in the storm, and the emotional weight of learning that David had lied to her about his time here all combined to make her feel suddenly exhausted. Where should I sleep? She asked. Jake gestured toward a doorway Emma hadn't noticed before. Guest rooms through there. Clean sheets, extra blankets. Bathrooms just past it if you need anything. Emma stood, surprised to find her legs still shaky from the ordeal. Jake, she said as he began banking the fire for the night. Thank you. For everything. I know saying it isn't enough, but I need you to know that what you did tonight, coming out in that storm for a stranger, it's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. Jake paused in his work, his hands still on the poker he was using to arrange the logs. For a moment Emma thought he might say something meaningful, might give her some glimpse into the man behind the careful control. Instead, he simply nodded. Sleep well, Emma Carter, he said quietly. Morning will come soon enough. Emma made her way to the guest room, which proved as thoughtfully appointed as the rest of the cabin. The bed was clearly handmade but comfortable, with quilts that looked like they'd been crafted by someone who understood both warmth and beauty. A small window looked out into the storm, though Emma could see nothing but swirling snow in the darkness beyond. As she settled under the covers, Emma found herself thinking about Jake's final words. There had been something in the way he'd said her name, a recognition that went beyond their brief introduction. She was certain now that David had told him more than just geological questions, had shared personal information that Jake wasn't ready to reveal. The thought that her late husband had confided in this isolated stranger while keeping secrets from her left Emma feeling unsettled and curious in equal measure. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Jake Sullivan's cabin, Emma Carter felt safer than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring answers, she was certain of that. But tonight, for the first time since David's death, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Emma woke to silence, so complete it felt almost oppressive after the chaos of the previous night's storm. Pale morning light filtered through the guest room window, revealing a world transformed. Snow covered everything in smooth, pristine curves that made the landscape look like something from a fairy tale. The trees were heavy with white, their branches bent under the weight, and the sky showed patches of blue between scattered clouds. She dressed quickly in the same clothes from yesterday, wishing she'd packed more practically for mountain weather. When she emerged from the guest room, she found Jake already up, standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee in his hands. He'd changed from his storm gear into worn jeans and a thick wool sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. In the morning light, Emma could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably closer to 40 than 50, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of experiences that aged a person beyond their years. Storms passed, he said without turning around. But you're not going anywhere for a while. Emma joined him at the window and immediately understood what he meant. The snow lay at least 3 feet deep across the clearing around his cabin, and the drifts were much higher. Her rental car was completely buried, nothing but a vague mound in the white expanse that might have been anything. How long before? The roads are passable? She asked. Jake finally looked at her, and Emma was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes. In daylight, she could see flecks of green in them, and the network of fine lines that spoke of years spent in harsh weather. Main highway will be cleared by this afternoon, assuming the plows are running. But the road to your car won't be passable for days unless we dig it out ourselves. Emma felt a flutter of panic at the thought of being stranded here for days. Not because she was afraid of Jake. Last night had proved he was trustworthy, but because the idea of extended isolation with this enigmatic man felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety. She asked. Jake nodded toward a door that seemed to lead to some kind of workshop or storage area. I've got tools, and the snow's not too heavy. If we work together, we can probably get to your car by this afternoon. Emma felt a surge of gratitude at the casual way he'd included her in the solution. In her marriage to David, she'd grown accustomed to being protected from problems rather than invited to help solve them. Jake's assumption that she would participate in her own rescue felt both refreshing and intimidating. I should warn you, I don't have much experience with manual labor, she admitted. Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. You made it through that storm last night. You're tougher than you think. The simple confidence in his voice made Emma stand a little straighter. When had someone last told her she was tough? David had always praised her intelligence, her grace, her ability to manage social situations, but no one had ever suggested she possessed physical courage or resilience. "Coffee's hot," Jake said, moving toward the stove. "You should eat something before we start. Going to be hard work." Emma accepted another mug of that perfectly brewed coffee and watched as Jake prepared what he called breakfast, but looked more like a feast to her. Eggs from chickens she could hear clucking somewhere outside, bread that was clearly homemade, and preserves that tasted like they'd been put up last summer. Everything was simple but executed with a level of care that elevated it beyond mere sustenance. "You really do live completely self-sufficiently up here," Emma observed. Jake nodded, seeming more comfortable discussing practical matters than personal ones. Garden in the summer, hunting, and preserved food through winter. Solar panels and a generator for electricity, well water, wood for heat. Haven't been to town in probably 6 months. Emma tried to imagine such complete isolation and found she couldn't. Her life in Denver was filled with constant human contact, neighbors, colleagues, service providers, casual interactions with strangers. The idea of going 6 months without speaking to another person seemed impossible. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jake's expression shuddered immediately, and Emma realized she'd touched on something he didn't want to discuss. "Loneliness is a choice," he said finally. "There are worse things than being alone." The cryptic response only intensified Emma's curiosity about what had driven him to this mountain, but she recognized the wall he'd thrown up and decided not to push. Instead, she helped clean up from breakfast, noting the efficiency of his kitchen setup and the careful way he maintained his equipment. Everything here spoke of someone who had learned to value self-reliance above all else. After breakfast, Jake led her to what proved to be an impressively equipped workshop attached to the cabin. Tools hung from pegboard walls with the kind of organization that spoke of years of careful habit. He selected shovels, picks, and other implements Emma couldn't identify, testing each one before adding it to their pile. "We'll start from here and work our way toward where your car should be," Jake explained, pulling on heavy work gloves. "Snow's deep, but it's not packed hard yet. Should come away in chunks if we're smart about it." Emma accepted the spare gloves he offered her, noting how small her hands looked inside leather that had clearly been shaped by years of Jake's use. They stepped outside into air so cold and clean it seemed to burn her lungs, but she found she was more prepared for it today. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving behind air so clear she could see mountain peaks that seemed impossibly distant. Jake began working immediately, attacking the snow with a systematic efficiency that made quick work of what had seemed like an impossible task. He didn't just shovel randomly, but carved strategic paths that allowed the snow to fall away in large sections. Emma tried to follow his lead, quickly discovering that her city-soft muscles were no match for this kind of work. "Don't fight the snow," Jake advised, noticing her struggles. "Work with its natural breaks. See how it wants to fracture, then help it along." Emma adjusted her technique and found the work became easier, though it was still exhausting. They labored in companionable silence, the only sounds their breathing and the soft whisper of snow being moved. Emma found herself watching Jake work, fascinated by the fluid economy of his movements. He never seemed to exert more effort than necessary, but he accomplished more in 10 minutes than she managed in 20. As they worked their way across the clearing, Emma began to understand why Jake had chosen this particular spot for his home. The cabin was positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and solar exposure, while remaining hidden from any casual observation. Someone could drive past on the road below and never suspect a structure existed up here. It was the perfect retreat for someone who wanted to disappear from the world. After 2 hours of steady work, they'd cleared enough space to reveal the outline of Emma's rental car. The vehicle looked small and vulnerable under its coating of snow, like a hibernating animal waiting for spring. Jake began digging around the driver's door with increased intensity, and Emma could see the goal was within reach. "Why did you really come here?" Jake asked suddenly, his voice casual, but his attention focused on his work. Emma paused, surprised by the question. "I told you, David's mining claim." "That's where you were going," Jake corrected, still not looking at her. "Not why you came." Emma leaned on her shovel, considering how to answer. The truth was complex, tied up with grief and confusion and a growing sense that the man she'd been married to for 8 years had been a stranger in many ways. "David died 6 weeks ago," she said finally. Heart attack. He was only 35, completely healthy as far as anyone knew. It was sudden and completely unexpected. Jake's digging slowed, though he didn't stop working. I'm sorry. Thank you. Emma resumed her own work, finding it easier to talk while her hands were busy. The thing is, in going through his affairs afterward, I discovered things. Trips I didn't know about, expenses I couldn't account for, correspondence with people he'd never mentioned. This mining claim was just the most expensive mystery. And you thought coming here would help you understand him better. I thought. It might help me understand whether I ever knew him at all, Emma admitted. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended, revealing the anger that lay beneath her grief. Jake finally looked up from his work, studying her face with those intense blue eyes. Secrets don't always mean what we think they mean, he said quietly. What do you mean? Jake returned to digging, but Emma could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Sometimes people keep secrets to protect others. Sometimes they keep them to protect themselves. David Carter struck me as a man carrying weight. He didn't want to share. The observation was perceptive and troubling in equal measure. Emma had suspected David was hiding something in the months before his death, but she'd attributed it to work stress or normal marital distance. The idea that he'd been protecting her from something felt both comforting and terrifying. What kind of weight? She asked. Jake was quiet for so long Emma thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. The kind that comes from making mistakes you can't undo. There was something in his tone that made Emma certain he was speaking from personal experience. She wanted to ask what mistakes had driven him to 20 years of isolation, but the careful walls in his expression warned her away from the question. They worked in silence for another hour until the car was fully excavated. Jake brushed snow off the windshield and hood while Emma cleared the exhaust pipe and side windows. When they were finished, the little rental car looked absurdly out of place in the pristine mountain setting, like an artifact from another world. Try starting it, Jake instructed. Emma slid into the driver's seat, noting how the interior felt almost tropically warm after hours in the mountain cold. She turned the key, and to her surprise, the engine turned over immediately. It ran rough for a few moments, then settled into a steady idle. Miracle of modern engineering, Jake observed with what sounded like approval. These little cars are tougher than they look. Emma felt a complex mix of relief and disappointment. The car worked, which meant she could leave, could continue on to Pine Ridge and David's mysterious mining claim. But leaving also meant returning to the confusion and loneliness that had driven her here in the first place, and something about that prospect felt unbearable. I should go, she said, though she made no move to put the car in gear. Jake stepped back from the vehicle, his expression unreadable. Road down to the highway should be passable. Take it slow, and if you start sliding, don't fight the wheel. Emma nodded, though she was barely listening to his advice. Instead, she found herself studying his face, trying to memorize the details she might never see again. The silver threading through his dark hair, the network of lines around his eyes, the way he held himself with quiet confidence that never quite masked an underlying sadness. Jake, she said impulsively, come with me. He looked genuinely surprised by the invitation. What? To Pine Ridge. You knew David, and you know this area better than anyone. Maybe you could help me understand what he was really doing here. Jake's expression shifted, cycling through emotions too quickly for Emma to identify. For a moment, she thought he might actually consider it. Then the walls came back up, harder than before. I don't go to town, he said firmly. Why not? Because I don't, Jake replied, stepping further back from the car. You should go. Afternoon's getting late, and you don't want to be driving these mountain roads after dark. Emma recognized the dismissal, but couldn't bring herself to accept it. Something had shifted between them during the morning's work, a connection that felt too valuable to simply abandon. Will I see you again? She asked. Jake met her eyes for a long moment, and Emma saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before he controlled it. Pine Ridge is a small town. Paths cross. It wasn't quite a promise, but it wasn't quite a denial either. Emma decided to take what hope she could from the ambiguous response. Thank you, she said again. For everything. Jake nodded once, then stepped back to give her room to maneuver. Emma put the car in reverse and began the careful process of backing out of the cleared space. As she reached the edge of Jake's property, She looked back through the rear window to see him standing motionless beside his cabin, watching her go. The drive down the mountain was treacherous, but manageable. Jake had been right about the main highway. It had been plowed and salted, though patches of ice still made for nervous driving. As Emma descended toward Pine Ridge, she found herself already missing the pristine silence of Jake's mountain retreat. The town, when it finally came into view, looked shabby and crowded after the stark beauty of the high country. Pine Ridge proved to be larger than Emma had expected, a collection of perhaps 300 souls clustered around a main street that catered to tourists heading to the ski resorts further up the mountains. She drove slowly through town, noting the mix of old mining-era buildings and newer construction designed to appeal to visitors with more money than sense. The mountain view inn sat at the far end of the main street, a three-story Victorian that had been restored with careful attention to period detail. Emma parked and gathered her bags, already dreading the return to normal human interaction after the strange intimacy of her time with Jake. The inn's lobby was decorated in what Emma recognized as calculated rustic charm, all exposed beams and antique mining equipment arranged for maximum tourist appeal. The woman behind the desk was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense bearing that suggested local roots rather than transplanted city sophistication. "You must be Mrs. Carter," the woman said before Emma could introduce herself. "I'm Ruth Henderson. We spoke on the phone about your reservation." Emma nodded, unsurprised that her arrival was already known. Small towns had their own communication networks that made cell phones seem slow by comparison. "How was your drive up?" Ruth continued, reaching for a registration book that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Heard we had quite a storm last night." "Interesting," Emma replied, not sure how to explain her adventure without revealing Jake's existence. She had the feeling he wouldn't appreciate becoming the subject of local gossip. Ruth's sharp eyes suggested she knew there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she handed Emma an old-fashioned brass key attached to a wooden tag. "Room 12, second floor, overlooks the main street. Breakfast is served until 9, dinner until 8. Anything else you need, just let me know." Emma's room proved comfortable in an aggressively quaint way, with a four-poster bed and furniture that had been chosen more for atmosphere than convenience. She unpacked her few belongings and stood at the window, looking down at the main street as late afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Tomorrow she would drive out to David's mining claim, would finally see what had drawn him to this place. But tonight, she found herself thinking not about her late husband's secrets, but about a man who had chosen complete isolation over whatever life he'd left behind 20 years ago. She wondered what Jake was doing now, whether he was sitting by his fire with one of those well-worn books, whether he ever thought about the world he'd abandoned. Most troubling of all, Emma found herself wondering whether she would have the courage to seek him out again, or whether their brief encounter would remain nothing more than a strange interlude in her journey toward understanding the man she'd thought she'd married. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, Emma Carter settled into her tourist-friendly room and tried not to think about how much she already missed the honest simplicity of Jake Sullivan's mountain cabin. Tomorrow would bring answers about David's mysterious activities, but tonight she was haunted by questions about a man who had saved her life and then disappeared back into the wilderness like something out of a dream. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sound of Jake's voice saying her name in the firelight, and the way something inside her had responded to the unexpected tenderness in his tone. Emma woke before dawn to the sound of voices in the street below. Peering through her window, she could see three men in heavy coats gathered near a black SUV. Their conversation too quiet to understand, but their body language suggesting serious business. One of them pointed toward the mountains, and Emma felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find Ruth Henderson already in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like fresh biscuits and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Early riser," Ruth observed, not looking up from her work. "Good thing, if you're planning to visit that claim of your husband's. Road up there gets dicey once the sun starts melting. The snow." "You know about David's property?" Emma asked, accepting the cup of coffee Ruth offered. "Honey, everybody knows everything in a town this size. Your husband was up here regular as clockwork for 3 months before he passed. Always asking questions. always poking around in places that made folks nervous. Emma settled onto a stool at the kitchen counter, intrigued by this glimpse into David's activities. What kind of questions? Ruth's expression grew cautious, the easy friendliness cooling slightly. Maybe you should ask Tom Bradley about that. He's our sheriff, knew your husband better than most. The suggestion felt more like a warning than helpful advice. Emma wondered what David had been doing that required interaction with local law enforcement. Is Sheriff Bradley available this morning? Emma asked. His office opens at 8. Just down the street, can't miss it. Ruth turned back to her biscuits, clearly signaling the conversation was over. Emma finished her coffee in silence, studying Ruth's suddenly closed expression and wondering what nerve she'd inadvertently touched. The older woman's demeanor suggested David's presence in Pine Ridge had been more controversial than Emma had realized. At 8 sharp, Emma presented herself at the sheriff's office, a small building sandwiched between a hardware store and what appeared to be the town's only restaurant. The man who greeted her was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from outdoor work rather than desk duty. "Mrs. Carter," he said, rising from behind a desk covered with paperwork. "Tom Bradley. I've been expecting you." Emma shook his offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Ruth Henderson suggested I speak with you about my husband's time here." Bradley gestured to a chair across from his desk, his expression carefully neutral. "David was a good man, from what I could tell. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, but I get the impression there's more to the story." Bradley leaned back in his chair, studying Emma with the kind of assessment she was becoming familiar with in this town. Everyone seemed to be measuring her, trying to determine how much she could handle. "Your husband was investigating some irregularities in local land development," Bradley said finally. "Nothing illegal, you understand, but some practices that raised ethical questions." Emma felt a familiar frustration. Even here, hundreds of miles from Denver, people were trying to protect her from uncomfortable truths. "What kind of practices?" "There's a development company that's been buying up properties around here. Blackwood Development, run by a man named Richard Blackwood. They've been particularly aggressive about acquiring land along what they claim will be a new highway corridor." The name meant nothing to Emma, but the sheriff's tone suggested it should. "And David was looking into this company. He came to me with concerns about their methods. Claimed they were using intimidation tactics, making offers that weren't really offers if you understand my meaning." Emma understood perfectly. She'd seen similar tactics in Denver's real estate market, though usually executed with more subtlety than small-town operations could manage. Did David have evidence of wrongdoing? Bradley's expression grew uncomfortable. He was working on gathering evidence. "But Mrs. Carter, I have to tell you, some folks weren't happy about an outsider stirring up trouble. There were suggestions that he should focus on his own business and leave local matters to local people." The veiled threat in the statement made Emma's pulse quicken. "Are you saying my husband was in danger?" "I'm saying small towns have their own ways of handling problems, and sometimes those ways don't appreciate outside interference." Bradley leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your husband's death was ruled natural causes, and I have no reason to question that determination. But if I were you, I'd be careful about continuing his investigation." Emma stared at the sheriff, trying to process the implications of what he'd just told her. David hadn't just been playing weekend prospector. He'd been conducting some kind of investigation into local corruption, and that investigation had made him enemies. "What about his mining claim?" she asked. "Was that part of his investigation?" "Eagles Point is good land, but it's not valuable for mining. Your husband knew that. I think he bought it for other reasons." "What reasons?" Bradley stood, clearly signaling the end of their conversation. "That's something you'd have to figure out for yourself, Mrs. Carter. But I'd suggest you be careful how you go about it." Emma left the sheriff's office more confused than enlightened. Every answer seemed to generate 3 new questions, and the picture of David that was emerging bore little resemblance to the man she'd thought she'd married. Her mild-mannered mathematics teacher husband had apparently been conducting some kind of investigation into local corruption, and his death might not have been as natural as everyone claimed. The drive to Eagles Point took her further into the mountains, following increasingly rough roads that eventually dwindled to little more than tire tracks in the snow. The landscape was breathtaking in its harsh beauty, all granite peaks and dense forest broken by clearings that offered glimpses of valleys far below. Emma found herself thinking of Jake's cabin, wondering if he could see this road from his mountain retreat. David's mining claim turned out to be a modest plot of land nestled in a valley between two ridges. A small creek ran through the property, and Emma could see evidence of previous mining activity in the form of old tailings piles and a few pieces of rusted equipment. But Bradley had been right. Even to Emma's inexperienced eye, the place looked thoroughly worked over. She parked near what appeared to be a more recent excavation and walked the perimeter of the property, trying to understand what had drawn David here. The land was beautiful, but seemed to offer little in the way of mineral wealth. As she explored, however, she began to notice details that suggested David had been here recently and frequently. A makeshift shelter constructed from tarps and poles, hidden among a stand of pine trees. A fire ring that showed recent use. Most intriguingly, surveying stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals, as if someone had been mapping the property with unusual precision. Near the center of the claim, Emma discovered something that made her pulse quicken. A metal strongbox, partially buried under a fallen log and carefully concealed from casual observation. Inside, wrapped in waterproof plastic, she found a collection of documents that made her understand why Sheriff Bradley had looked so uncomfortable. David had indeed been investigating Blackwood development, and his research was both thorough and damning. Copies of property deeds showing suspicious patterns of ownership transfer, photographs of damaged property belonging to landowners who had refused to sell, financial records suggesting connections between Blackwood and various local officials. Most troubling of all, a detailed timeline documenting what appeared to be a systematic campaign of intimidation against anyone who opposed the company's expansion plans. One name appeared repeatedly throughout David's notes, always accompanied by question marks and expressions of concern. Jake Sullivan. According to David's research, Jake owned a significant piece of property in the mountains above Pine Ridge, land that Blackwood desperately wanted for their development project. The notes suggested David had been trying to contact Jake to warn him about Blackwood's methods and possibly to enlist his help in exposing the company's practices. Emma sat back on her heels, struggling to process this information. Jake hadn't mentioned owning property that might be of interest to developers, had given no indication that he might be a target of the same forces that had apparently threatened her husband. But David's notes painted a picture of a man under siege, someone who had retreated to the mountains not just for solitude but for protection. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her thoughts. Emma quickly returned the documents to their hiding place and emerged from the trees to find Richard Blackwood himself climbing out of an expensive SUV, accompanied by two men who looked more like security than business associates. Blackwood was exactly the kind of man Emma had expected to find behind a predatory development company. Well-dressed in a way that suggested money without taste, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of getting his own way through intimidation rather than persuasion. He approached Emma with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I presume." "Richard Blackwood, Blackwood Development. I'm sorry we're meeting under such tragic circumstances." Emma forced herself to remain calm, though every instinct told her to run. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't expecting company. I heard you were in town. Thought I'd introduce myself. Your husband and I had some business discussions before his untimely passing." Emma seriously doubted David would have described their interactions as business discussions, given what she'd just read in his hidden files. "What kind of business?" "Land acquisition primarily. This is beautiful property, but it's not really suitable for individual ownership. Too remote, too difficult to develop properly." Blackwood gestured expansively at the surrounding wilderness. "I'd be happy to take it off your hands at a fair price. Save you the trouble of dealing with mountain property from Denver." The offer was delivered with the kind of casual presumption that suggested Blackwood was accustomed to people accepting his proposals without question. Emma found his assumption infuriating. "That's very generous, but I'm not interested in selling." Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Carter, I don't think you understand the challenges of maintaining property in this area. The winters alone can be brutal, and there are safety concerns for someone unfamiliar with mountain conditions." The veiled threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone he'd used to discuss the weather, but Emma caught the underlying menace. She thought of David's hidden files, of Sheriff Bradley's careful warnings, of the pattern of intimidation that seemed to follow anyone who opposed Blackwood's plans. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle mountain conditions just fine. One of Blackwood's companions stepped forward slightly, and Emma noticed the bulge of a concealed weapon under his jacket. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Of course, Blackwood said smoothly. But consider this. Accidents happen in the mountains all the time. People get lost, equipment fails, weather turns dangerous without warning. It would be tragic if something happened to David's widow while she was trying to honor his memory. Emma felt ice forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The threat was now explicit, delivered with a casualness that suggested Blackwood had made similar statements many times before. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood? Threatening? Mrs. Carter, I'm simply pointing out realities. The mountains can be dangerous for people who don't know how to handle themselves. He glanced meaningfully at his companions. Of course, some people are better equipped to deal with those dangers than others. Emma thought of Jake, alone in his mountain cabin, possibly unaware that these men were targeting him. She thought of David, who had died suddenly and mysteriously while investigating Blackwood's activities. Most of all, she thought of the documents hidden just yards away, evidence that could expose everything if it fell into the right hands. I'll consider your offer, she lied, hoping to buy time and distance. Blackwood's smile returned to its previous warmth, though his eyes remained cold. Excellent. I'll have my lawyers draw up papers. We can settle this quickly and quietly, which I think would be best for everyone involved. After Blackwood and his men departed, Emma sat in her car for a long time, hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. She was now certain that David's death hadn't been natural, that he'd been murdered for getting too close to exposing Blackwood's criminal activities. And she was equally certain that she was now in the same danger. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt like the longest journey of her life. Every vehicle that appeared in her rearview mirror seemed threatening. Every sound from the forest made her jump. By the time she reached the Mountain View Inn, Emma was a nervous wreck, jumping at shadows and seeing potential enemies in every face. Ruth Henderson took one look at her and immediately ushered her into the kitchen, pressing a cup of tea into her hands and settling beside her with motherly concern. Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened up there? Emma wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden of knowledge that felt too heavy to carry alone. But she remembered Sheriff Bradley's warnings about local loyalties and wondered how far Blackwood's influence extended. I met Richard Blackwood, Emma said carefully. Ruth's expression darkened immediately. That man's a cancer on this community. What did he want? To buy David's property. He was very insistent about it. I'll bet he was. Ruth's voice carried a bitterness that surprised Emma. That bastard's been terrorizing folks around here for 2 years, trying to force them off land their families have owned for generations. Emma felt a surge of relief at finding someone willing to speak openly about Blackwood. Has he threatened you? Not directly, but my nephew Danny worked for one of his construction crews last summer. Quit after a week, said the whole operation was dirty as they come. Corners cut everywhere, safety regulations ignored, workers treated like dirt. Emma leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. Did Danny ever mention anything about surveillance? About Blackwood keeping tabs on people who opposed him? Ruth's eyes sharpened with interest. Why do you ask? Emma made a decision to trust her instincts about Ruth's character. Because I think David was investigating Blackwood when he died, and I think Blackwood might have had him killed. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's face. When she spoke, her voice was deadly serious. If that's true, honey, then you're in more danger than you know. Blackwood doesn't leave loose ends. The confirmation of her fears sent a chill through Emma's entire body. She was a mathematics teacher from Denver, completely unprepared for the kind of danger she'd stumbled into. But she was also David's widow, the only person who knew about his hidden evidence, and possibly the only one who could bring his killers to justice. What should I do? Emma asked. Ruth considered this carefully. First thing, you need protection. Someone who knows these mountains and can keep you safe while you figure out your next move. Emma immediately thought of Jake, alone in his cabin, with no idea that Blackwood was targeting his property. The thought of him facing Blackwood's thugs without warning made her stomach clench with fear. I need to warn someone, Emma said. There's a man named Jake Sullivan who lives in the mountains. According to David's notes, Blackwood wants his land too. Ruth's reaction was immediate and surprising. Her face went pale, and she nearly dropped her teacup. Jake Sullivan? You know Jake Sullivan? Emma nodded, puzzled by Ruth's shocked response. He helped me during the storm last night. Why? Do you know him? Ruth stared at Emma as if seeing her for the first time. Honey, Jake Sullivan hasn't been seen in Pine Ridge for 20 years. Most folks assumed he was dead. Emma felt the world shift beneath her feet once again. What do you mean? Who is he? Ruth rose and moved to the window, peering out at the mountains as if she could somehow see Jake's hidden cabin from here. When she turned back to Emma, her expression was troubled. Jake Sullivan used to live here in town. Was married to a local girl named Sarah, sweetest thing you ever saw. They were building a house up on Maple Street, planning to start a family. Ruth's voice grew sad. Then there was an accident. Emma's pulse quickened. What kind of accident? Construction accident at the new elementary school. Jake was the project manager responsible for safety on the site. There was a problem with some scaffolding, and it collapsed. 3 workers were killed, including Sarah's younger brother Tommy. Emma felt sick. She could see where this story was going, could imagine the guilt and trauma that would drive someone to complete isolation. Jake blamed himself, Ruth continued. Even though the investigation showed it wasn't his fault, that the scaffolding had been sabotaged by someone trying to make the project fail. Jake couldn't live with the knowledge that people had died on his watch. What happened to Sarah? Ruth's expression grew even sadder. She tried to help him through it, but the guilt consumed him. He became obsessed with the idea that everyone he cared about was in danger because of him. One morning, Sarah woke up and he was gone. Left a note saying he had to leave to keep her safe. Emma thought of the haunted look in Jake's eyes, the careful walls he maintained around himself, the way he lived in complete isolation. 20 years of carrying that burden, 20 years of believing he was too dangerous to love or be loved. Sarah never remarried. She waited for him for 5 years, then finally accepted that he wasn't coming back. Married a good man from Grand Junction, moved away. But I heard she never got over losing Jake. Emma felt tears forming at the tragedy of it all. Jake had sacrificed his entire life, his marriage, his connection to community, based on a guilt that wasn't even justified. And now he was in danger again, this time from forces that had nothing to do with construction accidents or sabotaged scaffolding. I have to warn him about Blackwood, Emma said. Ruth shook her head. Honey, if Jake wanted contact with the outside world, he'd have it. He's chosen isolation for a reason. But he saved my life, Emma protested. And he's in danger whether he knows it or not. I can't just leave him defenseless. Ruth studied Emma's face, seeing something there that made her expression soften. You care about him. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, surprised by how obvious her feelings apparently were. He's a good man who's been punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. Someone needs to tell him the truth. And you think that someone is? You? Emma met Ruth's gaze directly. I think I'm the only one who can reach him right now. And I think he might be the only one who can help me stop Blackwood before more people get hurt. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she nodded. There's something you should know about that construction accident, she said quietly. Something that was never made public. Emma leaned forward, sensing another crucial piece of the puzzle. The investigation showed the scaffolding was sabotaged, but they never found out who did it or why. But there were rumors, suggestions that someone wanted that school project to fail. Ruth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone who stood to profit if the town couldn't afford to build a new school. Emma felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Blackwood. He wasn't called Blackwood back then, went by his real name of Richard Black. But yes, he was already working angles, already trying to control development in this area. The school project would have brought in state funding, made the town less dependent on private development. The full scope of Blackwood's evil was becoming clear. Not only had he been intimidating landowners and possibly murdering people who opposed him, but he'd orchestrated the accident that had destroyed Jake's life 20 years ago. Jake doesn't know, Emma said with certainty. He still thinks it was his fault, and telling him the truth might destroy him all over again, Ruth warned. Or it might give him reason to finally come home. Emma thought of Jake's careful isolation, his obvious intelligence and skills being wasted in solitude, his capacity for heroism demonstrated by his rescue of her in the storm. A man like that shouldn't be hiding in the mountains, carrying guilt for crimes committed by others. He deserves to know, Emma said firmly. And I'm going to tell him. Ruth sighed, recognizing the determination in Emma's voice. Then you'd better be prepared for the consequences. Truth has a way of changing everything, and not always for the better. As evening fell over Pine Ridge, Emma sat in her room at the Mountain View Inn, staring out at the mountains and trying to prepare herself for what lay ahead. Tomorrow she would return to Jake's cabin, would tell him the truth about the accident that had shaped his life, and would ask for his help in stopping the man who had caused so much suffering. She thought of Blackwood's threats, of David's hidden evidence, of the web of corruption and violence that seemed to entangle everyone who opposed the development company's plans. She was about to put herself and Jake in terrible danger, but she could see no alternative. The truth had to come out, and justice had to be served, no matter the cost. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent and imposing against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, Jake Sullivan was probably sitting by his fire, reading one of his books, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to change forever. Emma only hoped she would have the courage to see it through, and that Jake would find the strength to face a truth he'd been hiding from for 20 years. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. Emma loaded her car with supplies she'd purchased at Ruth Henderson's recommendation: heavy gloves, emergency food, a better winter coat, and most importantly, a detailed topographical map that would help her find Jake's cabin without getting lost. Ruth had tried one last time to dissuade her from making the journey alone, but Emma was determined. She had spent the night reading through more of David's hidden research, and the picture that emerged was even more damning than she'd initially realized. Blackwood's organization was essentially a criminal enterprise, using intimidation, sabotage, and quite possibly murder to acquire properties throughout the region. Jake's land was apparently crucial to their plans, sitting at the center of what would become a massive development project if Blackwood succeeded in driving out all the current landowners. The drive up to Jake's mountain took longer than expected, partly because Emma was being more careful on the snowy roads, and partly because she kept checking her rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. Blackwood had made it clear that he was watching her, and she had no doubt that her movements were being monitored. But the road to Jake's cabin was hidden and difficult to follow, and she saw no evidence that anyone was tracking her progress. When she finally reached the clearing where Jake's cabin sat, Emma was struck again by the beauty and isolation of the place. In the bright morning sunlight, with snow sparkling on the trees and smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still air, it looked like something from a fairy tale. Jake himself was outside when she arrived, splitting firewood with the kind of easy rhythm that spoke of thousands of repetitions. He looked up as her car approached, and Emma saw surprise and something else, something that might have been pleasure, cross his features before he controlled his expression. "Didn't expect to see you again," Jake said as Emma climbed out of her car. "Especially not this soon." Emma felt suddenly nervous, uncertain how to begin the conversation that would change everything between them. "I need to talk to you. About David, about why he really came here, and about something that happened 20 years ago." Jake's expression closed immediately, the familiar walls snapping into place. "I told you, I don't discuss the past. Even if that past is based on lies," Emma challenged. "Even if you've been punishing yourself for 20 years for something that wasn't your fault." Jake went very still, the axe frozen in his hands. For a moment Emma thought he might order her to leave, might retreat into his cabin and refuse to listen. Instead, he set the axe aside and looked at her with eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. "What are you talking about?" Emma took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would either help heal a 20-year-old wound or inflict new damage that might be irreparable. "I'm talking about the construction accident at the elementary school. The one that killed Tommy Morrison and 2 other workers. The one that made you leave Pine Ridge and Sarah behind." Jake's face went white, and he actually took a step backward as if Emma had struck him. "How do you know about that?" "Because David was investigating. The same man who caused it. And because the people in town remember what happened. They remember that you weren't at fault, that the scaffolding was sabotaged." "I was the project manager," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Those men died because I didn't protect them. Emma moved closer, reaching out to touch his arm. Jake, they died because Richard Blackwood sabotaged that scaffolding to make the school project fail. He wanted the town dependent on his development plans, and a successful public project would have interfered with his agenda. Jake stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. That's impossible. Blackwood wasn't even in Pine Ridge 20 years ago. He was going by his real name then, Richard Black. But it was him, Jake. He's been manipulating this community for decades, destroying lives to get what he wants. Emma pulled out copies of David's research that she'd brought with her. My husband was investigating him when he died, and I think Blackwood had him killed to stop the investigation. Jake took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, scanning the documents with the kind of focused intensity Emma remembered from their first meeting. She watched his face change as he processed the information, saw the moment when the full implications hit him. "My God," he whispered. "All these years I thought. You thought you were responsible for those deaths, so you exiled yourself to protect everyone you cared about." Emma's voice was gentle but firm. "But you were never the villain in this story, Jake. You were just another one of Blackwood's victims." Jake sank onto the porch steps of his cabin, still clutching David's research. Emma could see 20 years of guilt and self-imposed isolation warring with this new understanding of the truth. The man who had saved her life was breaking apart before her eyes, and she wasn't sure if that was healing or destruction. "Sarah," he said finally. "I left Sarah because you thought staying would put her in danger, because you thought you were cursed, that everyone you cared about would be hurt because of your failures." Emma sat beside him on the steps, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to overwhelm him. "But it was all a lie, Jake. Blackwood created that accident to serve his own purposes, and you've been carrying his guilt for 20 years. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains that had been his refuge and his prison. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with pain. "I destroyed my life for nothing. I threw away everything that mattered because I believed a lie." "You can't change the past," Emma said softly. "But you can stop Blackwood from destroying more lives. He's still operating, still using the same tactics. Right now he's threatening me, and according to David's research, he wants your land for his next development project." Jake looked up at her, and Emma saw something new in his expression, something that looked like the man he might have been if 20 years of guilt hadn't broken him. "He threatened you?" "Yesterday, at David's mining claim. Made it very clear that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with his plans." Jake's expression hardened in a way that made Emma suddenly glad he was on her side. "That bastard. He's not content with destroying the past. He has to keep poisoning the present." "Will you help me stop him?" Emma asked. "David gathered evidence, but he's gone now. I can't do this alone, and you know this area better than anyone." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Emma had the sense that he was seeing her, clearly for the first time since they'd met. Not just as the woman he'd rescued from the storm, but as someone who might be worth fighting for. "You could have taken that evidence to the authorities in Denver, let them handle it," he pointed out. "Why come back here? Why risk confronting Blackwood directly?" Emma considered how to answer, knowing that her response would reveal more about her feelings than she was entirely comfortable sharing. "Because this is personal now. He killed my husband, and he's been destroying lives here for decades. Because you deserve to know the truth about what happened 20 years ago." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I couldn't bear the thought of you facing this alone." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than Emma had intended, but completely honest. Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and something deeper. "You barely know me," he said. "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to risk your life for a stranger. I know you're skilled enough to survive 20 years alone in these mountains. I know you're intelligent enough to have figured out Blackwood's game long ago, if anyone had bothered to tell you the truth." Emma met his gaze directly. "And I know you're good enough to deserve better than spending the rest of your life hiding from crimes you didn't commit." Jake was quiet for another long moment, then stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the valley below. Emma waited, understanding that he was wrestling with 20 years of carefully constructed isolation, trying to decide whether he could trust himself to re-enter a world that had caused him such pain. "If we do this," he said finally, "if we go after Blackwood, there's no going back. He won't just threaten you next time. He'll try to kill us both. He's probably going to try that anyway, Emma pointed out. At least this way we fight back. Jake turned to look at her, and Emma saw the decision forming in his eyes. Then I guess we'd better make sure we win. Emma felt a surge of relief. And something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. For the first time since David's death, she wasn't facing an impossible situation alone. More than that, she was facing it with someone who had every reason to want justice as much as she did. What do we do first? She asked. Jake's expression was already becoming focused and determined, the aimless guilt of the last 20 years being replaced by purposeful anger. First, we go through your husband's evidence properly, figure out exactly what we're dealing with. Then we decide whether we take it to outside authorities or handle it ourselves. And if we decide to handle it ourselves, Jake's smile was not entirely pleasant. Then Richard Blackwood is about to discover that some people don't stay buried, no matter how deep you think you've planted them. As they prepared to enter the cabin and begin planning their campaign against the man who had destroyed so many lives, Emma felt a strange sense of rightness about what they were undertaking. David's death would be avenged, Jake's exile would finally end, and perhaps, if they were very lucky and very careful, they might both find something worth fighting for in each other. The war room Jake created in his cabin looked nothing like what Emma had expected. Within hours of her revelation about Blackwood's true nature, Jake had transformed his dining area into a command center that would have impressed military strategists. Maps covered every surface, marked with colored pins and connecting strings that traced patterns of land ownership, timeline correlations, and suspected criminal activities. David's research formed the foundation, but Jake had added layers of analysis that revealed the true scope of Blackwood's operation. Your husband was methodical, but he was thinking like an academic, Jake explained, pointing to a detailed chart he'd created showing property acquisitions over the past 5 years. Look at this pattern. Blackwood isn't just buying random parcels. He's creating a corridor. Emma studied the map, beginning to see what Jake meant. The properties Blackwood had acquired formed a rough line stretching from the valley floor up into the mountains, following natural contours that would be ideal for large-scale development. A ski resort, she breathed, understanding dawning. He's planning to build a massive ski resort. Jake nodded grimly. Not just a resort, an entire destination community. Hotels, condos, shopping centers, the works. Property values would increase 1,000-fold, but only for people who got in early. People like Blackwood. Exactly. And anyone who refuses to sell becomes an obstacle to hundreds of millions in development profits. Emma felt sick as the full implications hit her. That's why he had David killed. The investigation was getting too close to exposing the plan. And why he wants my land so badly, Jake added, pointing to his property on the map. I own the Keystone parcel. Without it, his corridor is broken and the whole project becomes economically unfeasible. Emma studied Jake's face as he analyzed the documents, noting how completely he'd thrown himself into this investigation. Gone was the hesitant, guilt-ridden hermit she'd found yesterday. In his place was a man of sharp intelligence and focused determination, someone who clearly possessed skills far beyond what 20 years of isolation should have preserved. Jake, she said carefully, what did you do before the construction? Accident. I mean, what was your profession? Jake glanced up from the maps, seeming surprised by the question. Civil engineering, project management. I specialized in large-scale infrastructure development. And before that, Jake's expression grew wary. Why do you ask? Because you're analyzing this like someone with military or law enforcement training. The way you organize information, the strategic thinking, the tactical awareness. That's not standard civil engineering curriculum. Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed and set down the document he'd been studying. Army Corps of Engineers, 8 years active duty. Did 2 tours overseas, mostly infrastructure development in hostile territories. Learned to think like both an engineer and a soldier. Emma felt pieces clicking into place. That's why you were so calm during the storm rescue. Why you move through these mountains like you were born here. Why you've been able to survive alone for 20 years. Military training has its uses, Jake acknowledged. Though I never thought I'd need combat skills in a place like Pine Ridge. Combat skills. Jake's expression hardened. Emma, what we're planning to do, exposing Blackwood and his organization, it's essentially a war. He's got money, political connections, and men who aren't afraid to use violence. We're going to need every advantage we can get. The sobering reality of their situation settled over Emma like a weight. She was a mathematics teacher who'd stumbled into a conspiracy that had already cost her husband's life, now planning to take on what amounted to an organized crime syndicate. Without Jake's skills and knowledge, she would have been completely helpless. "What do I need to learn?" she asked. Jake looked at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. "You're sure about this? Once we start active operations against Blackwood, there's no safe retreat." "I'm sure," Emma said firmly. "David died trying to expose this. I won't let that be for nothing." Jake studied her for another moment, then nodded. "All right. First lesson, situational awareness. In a hostile environment, your survival depends on seeing threats before they see you." What followed was the most intensive education Emma had ever received. Jake taught her to read terrain like a book, identifying natural cover, escape routes, and vantage points. He showed her how to move quietly through forest and over snow, how to observe without being observed, how to identify the subtle signs that indicated human presence in wilderness areas. More practically, he taught her to use tools that might save her life. Basic first aid, emergency communication protocols, and most unsettling of all, how to handle firearms safely and effectively. "I've never shot a gun," Emma protested as Jake produced a compact pistol from what appeared to be a well-stocked arsenal hidden throughout his cabin. "Then you need to learn," Jake said matter-of-factly. "Blackwood's men won't hesitate to use lethal force. You need to be prepared to defend yourself." The shooting lessons took place in a natural clearing behind Jake's cabin, with targets set up against a hillside that would safely stop any stray rounds. Emma's first attempts were clumsy and nerve-wracking, the weapon feeling alien and dangerous in her hands. But Jake was a patient teacher, adjusting her stance and grip, explaining the mechanics of sight alignment and trigger control with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. "You're thinking too much," Jake observed after Emma's fifth consecutive miss. "Shooting is about muscle memory and instinct, not intellectual analysis." "Everything I do is intellectual analysis," Emma replied, frustrated. "I'm a teacher, not a soldier." Jake moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the pistol grip. "Then stop being a teacher for a minute and just be present. Feel the weight of the weapon, the rhythm of your breathing, the stillness between heartbeats." His closeness was distracting in ways that had nothing to do with firearms instruction. Emma could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. When he spoke, his breath stirred the hair near her ear, sending unexpected shivers down her spine. "Focus on the front sight," Jake murmured, his voice low and steady. "Everything else is just noise." Emma tried to concentrate on his instruction, but her awareness kept shifting to the man behind her, to the gentle strength in his hands as he guided her movements, to the way her pulse quickened at his proximity. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the shot went wide by several inches. "Better," Jake said, seeming oblivious to the effect he was having on her. "You're getting the feel for it." They continued practicing until Emma could hit the target consistently, though she suspected her improved accuracy had more to do with Jake's hands-on coaching than any natural aptitude for marksmanship. When they finally finished, Emma's arms ached from the unfamiliar exertion, but she felt more capable than she had since arriving in Colorado. "Not bad for a first-timer," Jake said as they walked back toward the cabin. "You learn quickly." "I had a good teacher," Emma replied, then immediately regretted the warmth in her tone. The last thing she needed was to complicate their professional relationship with personal feelings. But Jake seemed unaware of any subtext, already shifting back into tactical planning mode. "Tomorrow we start active reconnaissance. I want to get close to Blackwood's operation, see what kind of security he's running, identify weaknesses we can exploit. Is that safe?" "Nothing about this is safe," Jake said bluntly. "But the alternative is waiting for him to eliminate us one at a time. Better to take the initiative." That evening, as they shared another of Jake's expertly prepared meals, Emma found herself studying him with new appreciation. The man who had seemed so isolated and damaged yesterday was revealing himself to be incredibly competent and surprisingly complex. His knowledge wasn't limited to survival skills and military tactics. He was well-read, articulate, and possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. "What were you like before?" Emma asked as they cleaned up after dinner. "Before the accident, I mean." "When?" "You lived in town." Jake's hands stilled in the dishwater, and Emma thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than pained. "Different. More optimistic, I suppose. I believed in building things. In making communities better. Sarah used to say I had too much faith in human nature." "She sounds wise." "She was. Is, I suppose. Assuming she's still alive." Jake's expression grew distant. "Sometimes I wonder what became of her, whether she's happy, whether she ever thinks about the man who abandoned her." Emma felt an unexpected stab of jealousy at the obvious love in Jake's voice when he spoke of his lost wife. She had no right to such feelings, no claim on Jake's emotions, but the realization that part of his heart was still occupied by someone else left her feeling oddly bereft. "You could find out," Emma suggested, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "About Sarah, I mean. Once this is over." Jake shook his head. "Too much time has passed. Too much damage done. Some things can't be repaired, no matter how much you might want them to be. But if she loved you once, if she loved me, then she deserved better than a man who would disappear in the night rather than face his problems." Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "I made that choice 20 years ago, and I have to live with the consequences." Emma wanted to argue, to point out that his choice had been based on lies and manipulation, that the circumstances were different now. But something in Jake's tone warned her away from the subject. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps some wounds went too deep to heal. Some losses were too permanent to reverse. They finished the dishes in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Later, as Emma prepared for another night in Jake's guest room, she found herself wondering about the dynamics of their partnership. They were bound together by necessity and shared purpose, but there were undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Jake's careful distance, his obvious struggle with trust and emotional connection, the way he seemed to see her as both ally and potential threat to his hard-won equilibrium. The next morning brought new challenges as they prepared for their reconnaissance mission. Jake outfitted Emma with appropriate gear: dark clothing, sturdy boots, a compact backpack containing emergency supplies. He moved through these preparations with military efficiency, checking and double-checking every detail. "Remember," he said as they prepared to leave the cabin, "we're observers only today. No contact, no confrontation, no unnecessary risks. Our job is to gather information and get out clean." Emma nodded, though she felt far from ready for what amounted to espionage operations. The weight of the pistol Jake had insisted she carry felt foreign against her hip, a constant reminder of how far she'd traveled from her comfortable life as a Denver teacher. The approach to Blackwood's main operations center required a challenging hike through dense forest and over terrain that would have been difficult even in good weather. With snow still covering much of the ground, it demanded every bit of woodcraft skill Jake had been teaching her. They moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen and observe, alert for any sign of security patrols or surveillance equipment. "There," Jake whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees toward a valley below. Emma followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. Blackwood's operation was far larger and more sophisticated than she'd imagined. Heavy construction equipment sat in organized rows, protected by temporary buildings that looked like they could house a small army. Security fencing surrounded the entire complex, and she could see guards patrolling the perimeter with professional precision. "It's huge," Emma breathed. Jake was studying the facility through binoculars, his expression grim. "This isn't just about a ski resort. Look at the equipment, the infrastructure they're building. This is preparation for something much bigger." Emma accepted the binoculars and examined the complex more closely. Jake was right. The scale of the operation suggested development plans far beyond anything she'd imagined. Roads were being carved through pristine wilderness. Enormous earth-moving machines were reshaping entire hillsides, and the amount of material being stockpiled indicated construction projects that would continue for years. "They're not just building a resort," Emma realized. "They're building a city." "A private city," Jake corrected. "Look at the security measures, the isolation, the self-contained infrastructure. Blackwood isn't just developing land. He's creating his own kingdom where he controls everything and everyone." The scope of Blackwood's ambition was staggering. Emma tried to imagine this pristine mountain valley transformed into a massive development, natural beauty sacrificed for profit and power. The thought made her sick. "We have to stop this," she said. Jake lowered his binoculars and looked at her seriously. "Emma, what we're looking at represents hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, years of planning, and connections to powerful people who have a lot to lose if this project fails. Stopping it won't be a matter of exposing corruption to local authorities. Then what will it take?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the complex below. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and cold. "War," he said simply. "It'll take a war." They spent the rest of the day gathering intelligence, mapping security positions, identifying patrol patterns, and documenting everything they observed. Jake approached the task with professional thoroughness, teaching Emma to think like an intelligence operative rather than a civilian observer. Always have an escape route planned, he instructed as they repositioned to observe from a different angle. Know where your enemies are, where your allies might be, and how to get from one to the other without being detected. "Do we have allies?" Emma asked. "We will," Jake said with confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Once people understand what Blackwood really represents, once they see the evidence your husband gathered, there will be others willing to fight. And if there aren't?" Jake met her gaze directly. "Then we fight alone and hope we're good enough to win." As the day wore on, Emma found herself developing a grudging respect for the complexity of what they were attempting. Exposing Blackwood wasn't just a matter of revealing evidence to authorities. The man had clearly spent years building a network of influence and protection that would shield him from normal legal consequences. Taking him down would require strategy, coordination, and a willingness to operate outside conventional channels. More troubling was her growing awareness of the danger they were placing themselves in. The security measures around Blackwood's operation were clearly designed to handle more than petty theft or vandalism. These were preparations for dealing with serious threats to a massive criminal enterprise and the men she observed through. The binoculars looked like professionals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who interfered with their work. "Jake," she said during one of their observation breaks, "what happens if we fail? What happens if Blackwood wins?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Then a lot of people lose their homes, their heritage, their connection to this place. The mountains become just another commodity to be exploited for maximum profit. And men like your husband die for nothing." The stark assessment sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. They were taking on forces far beyond their capability to control, gambling with stakes they couldn't afford to lose. But the alternative, allowing Blackwood's corruption to continue unchallenged, felt like a betrayal of everything David had died for. As they prepared to return to Jake's cabin, Emma realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship over the course of the day. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They had become partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared danger and common purpose. More than that, she was beginning to see Jake not as the damaged hermit she'd first encountered, but as a man of extraordinary capability and hidden depths. The way he moved through dangerous terrain with absolute confidence, the careful precision with which he planned and executed their reconnaissance, the depth of knowledge he brought to every aspect of their mission. This was not a man who belonged in exile. This was someone who had spent 20 years preparing himself, perhaps unconsciously, for exactly this kind of challenge. "Thank you," Emma said as they hiked back through the darkening forest. "For what?" "For believing this is worth fighting for. For not letting me face this alone." Jake stopped walking and turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Emma, I need you to understand something. What we're doing, the path we're choosing, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Blackwood won't just try to stop us. He'll try to destroy us completely. I know. Do you? Because once we commit to this course, there's no going back to your safe life in Denver. Win or lose, you'll be changed by this experience in ways you can't predict." Emma met his gaze steadily. "I'm already changed. David's death changed me. Learning the truth about what happened to you changed me. I can't go back to pretending the world is a safe place where good people are protected and justice prevails." Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Emma had the sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time since they'd met. not as the helpless city woman he'd rescued from the storm, but as someone who might be capable of standing beside him in what was to come. "All right then," he said finally. "Tomorrow we start planning our war." As they completed the journey back to Jake's cabin, Emma felt a mixture of fear and anticipation that was becoming familiar. She was walking away from everything she'd known, everything safe and predictable about her life. But she was walking toward something as well, toward a purpose that felt more meaningful than anything she'd ever attempted, and toward a man who was revealing himself to be far more complex and compelling than she'd imagined possible. The war against Richard Blackwood was about to begin, and Emma Carter was ready to fight. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after their reconnaissance mission to Blackwood's compound. Emma woke to the sound of Jake moving through the cabin. With silent urgency, checking windows and securing equipment with practiced efficiency that spoke of long-dormant military instincts suddenly reactivated. "How many?" she whispered, rolling out of bed and reaching for the clothes she'd learned to keep within arm's reach. "For vehicles, maybe 12 men. Professional setup, coordinated approach from multiple directions." Jake's voice was calm, but tense. "They're not here to negotiate." Emma felt her pulse spike as the reality of their situation hit her. This wasn't another planning session or training exercise. Blackwood had found them, and he'd sent enough firepower to ensure there would be no survivors to continue David's investigation. "Exit strategy?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Jake nodded toward the back of the cabin. "Emergency tunnel leads to the storage shed. From there we can reach the tree line without being observed." "But Emma." He paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "Once we run, we can never come back here. This place, everything I've built over 20 years, it's gone." Emma saw the pain flash across his features before he controlled it. This cabin wasn't just shelter to Jake. It was sanctuary, redemption. The place where he'd rebuilt himself after losing everything that mattered. Now Blackwood was taking that away too, forcing him back into a world that had already broken him once. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate. "Don't be. I should have left years ago." Jake shouldered a pack he'd clearly prepared for this possibility, then handed Emma a similar bag. "Should have stopped running and started fighting back." The sound of vehicles surrounding the cabin grew louder, engines positioning for what was obviously a coordinated assault. Emma could hear men calling to each other in the professional shorthand of military or law enforcement, confirming positions and preparing for breach operations. "Move," Jake ordered, pulling open a concealed panel in the cabin's floor. The tunnel was narrow and uncomfortable, clearly designed for emergency use rather than convenience. They crawled through darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, emerging in Jake's storage shed as the first shots began shattering. Windows in the cabin behind them. Automatic weapons, Jake observed grimly, listening to the distinctive sound of rapid fire. "They're not planning to take prisoners." From the shed, they could see Jake's cabin being systematically destroyed by men who moved with military precision. Emma recognized the tactical efficiency from news footage of overseas conflicts, but seeing it deployed in the Colorado mountains against them felt surreal and terrifying. "This way," Jake whispered, leading her toward the tree line through a route that took advantage of natural cover and avoided sight lines from the cabin. They moved through the forest with desperate stealth, every sound seeming amplified in the crisp morning air. Behind them, the destruction of Jake's home continued with methodical thoroughness. Emma could smell smoke now, indicating that Blackwood's men were ensuring nothing would be left to examine. "Where are we going?" Emma asked when they finally stopped to rest in a dense stand of pine trees half a mile from the cabin. "Safe house," Jake replied, checking his compass and studying the terrain ahead. "Abandoned mining station about 5 miles north. I've kept it stocked with supplies in case something like this happened." Emma marveled at his foresight even as she struggled to process what they'd just escaped. "You planned for this possibility?" "I've been planning for various possibilities for 20 years, Jake said matter-of-factly. "Military training doesn't leave you, and living alone in hostile territory requires contingency thinking." They resumed their trek through increasingly difficult terrain, Jake setting a pace that challenged Emma's fitness but remained sustainable over distance. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder, but Emma found herself drawing strength from Jake's steady presence beside her. "How did they find us?" she asked during another brief rest. Jake's expression was grim. "Someone talked. Either that, or Blackwood has surveillance capabilities we didn't account for." The possibility that they'd been betrayed by someone in Pine Ridge sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Ruth Henderson had seemed trustworthy, and Sheriff Bradley had appeared genuinely concerned for Emma's safety. But Blackwood's influence was clearly more extensive than they'd realized. "What about the evidence?" Emma asked, suddenly panicked. "David's research, all the documentation we've gathered." Jake patted his pack. "Digital copies on encrypted drives, hard copies distributed to multiple locations. Destroying my cabin won't stop the investigation." Emma felt a surge of admiration for Jake's thoroughness. While she'd been learning to shoot and conduct surveillance, he'd been systematically preparing for exactly this kind of escalation. The hermit she'd first met was revealing himself to be far more capable and strategic than she'd imagined. The safe house turned out to be a substantial structure built into the side of a mountain, camouflaged so effectively that Emma almost walked past it despite Jake's directions. Inside, she found a fully equipped survival facility with food, water, communication equipment, and enough weapons to outfit a small military unit. "How long have you been preparing for war?" Emma asked, awed by the scale of Jake's preparations. 20 years, Jake replied simply. "I told myself it was just prudent preparation for mountain living, but I think part of me always knew this day would come." Emma studied the maps and equipment scattered throughout the facility, beginning to understand the depth of Jake's planning. This wasn't paranoia. This was the methodical preparation of someone who understood that powerful enemies eventually required armed resistance. "What's our next move?" she asked. Jake activated a sophisticated radio system, scanning frequencies with practiced efficiency. "First, we find out how much damage Blackwood thinks he's done. Then we start hitting back." The radio intercepts revealed that Blackwood's men believed they'd eliminated both Emma and Jake in the cabin attack. Bodies had been found, though. Emma suspected they were probably unfortunate individuals who'd been used to stage the scene. As far as Blackwood knew, his primary threats had been neutralized. "Good," Jake said with satisfaction. "Being dead gives us tactical advantages." Emma wasn't sure she liked the cold calculation in his voice, but she had to admit the logic was sound. If Blackwood thought they were eliminated, he'd be less cautious about his operations, more vulnerable to surveillance and sabotage. Over the next several days, Jake transformed their mountain hideout into a command center that would have impressed professional intelligence services. Using equipment Emma hadn't known existed, he monitored Blackwood's communications, tracked the movement of personnel and equipment, and began identifying vulnerabilities in what had seemed like an impregnable organization. "Here," Jake said, pointing to intercepts he'd gathered showing financial transfers between Blackwood's accounts and various offshore entities. "He's moving money ahead of schedule, probably because he thinks the investigation is finished. That makes him vulnerable to financial tracking." Emma studied the data, her mathematical background helping her recognize patterns in the transactions. "He's also paying unusual bonuses to his security personnel. Either he's rewarding them for eliminating us, or he's preparing for expanded operations." "Both, probably," Jake agreed. "Which means we need to move fast before he consolidates his position." The plan Jake developed was ambitious and dangerous in equal measure. Rather than simply gathering evidence for authorities who might be compromised, they would launch a coordinated campaign designed to destroy Blackwood's organization from within. Financial sabotage, communications disruption, and strategic elimination of key personnel would cripple his operations while making it impossible for him to rebuild. "This is beyond anything I imagined when I came here," Emma said as Jake outlined the full scope of their intended operations. "There usually is," Jake replied. "The question is whether you're committed to seeing it through to the end." Emma thought of David, killed for trying to expose corruption. She thought of Jake, exiled for 20 years because of Blackwood's manipulations. She thought of all the families who would lose their homes and heritage if Blackwood's development proceeded unchallenged. "I'm committed," she said firmly. Jake studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." The first phase of their campaign targeted Blackwood's financial infrastructure. Using skills he'd apparently acquired during his years of isolation, Jake penetrated the security systems protecting Blackwood's accounts and began systematically redistributing funds to environmental organizations and legal aid societies. The transfers were designed to look like legitimate donations, making them difficult to reverse while ensuring the money would be used to fight exactly the kind of corruption Blackwood represented. Emma's role was coordination and intelligence analysis, using her mathematical skills to identify patterns and predict Blackwood's responses to their attacks. She found herself adapting to clandestine operations with surprising ease, her academic background providing unexpected advantages in strategic planning and data analysis. "You're good at this," Jake observed after Emma successfully predicted Blackwood's attempt to consolidate his remaining funds in overseas accounts. "Have you considered a career change?" Emma laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "From teaching mathematics to fighting organized crime? It's not exactly a conventional progression." "Nothing about this situation is conventional," Jake pointed out. "But you have instincts for this kind of work. The ability to see patterns, to think several steps ahead, to remain calm under pressure." The compliment warmed Emma more than it should have, given their circumstances. Over the weeks they'd been working together, she developed a deep respect for Jake's capabilities and judgment. His approval meant more to her than she was entirely comfortable acknowledging. The second phase of their operations focused on communications disruption. Jake had identified the relay stations and transmission equipment that allowed Blackwood to coordinate his scattered operations and systematically began destroying them through a combination of electronic warfare and old-fashioned sabotage. Signal intelligence is crucial to any large-scale operation, Jake explained as they prepared for a nighttime assault on a communications tower. Cut off the head's ability to talk to the hands, and the whole body becomes ineffective. Emma had learned to move through darkness with confidence, to handle explosives safely, and to retreat from target areas without leaving evidence. Skills she'd never imagined needing were becoming second nature, and she found herself taking pride in her growing competence. The attack on the communications tower went perfectly, with Jake's demolition work eliminating Blackwood's primary coordination capability while making the destruction appear accidental. As they watched the structure collapse from their observation position half a mile away, Emma felt a savage satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. "I'm becoming someone I don't recognize," she admitted to Jake as they hiked back to their base. "You're becoming someone who doesn't accept injustice quietly," Jake corrected. "That's not a bad thing to be." Emma wasn't entirely convinced, but she had to admit that her new capabilities felt empowering in ways her previous life never had. Teaching mathematics to uninterested students seemed trivial compared to actively fighting against corruption and murder. The third phase targeted Blackwood's personnel, though Jake insisted they focus on disruption rather than elimination. Key supervisors found themselves under investigation for various regulatory violations. Equipment operators discovered their machinery sabotaged in ways that caused delays without endangering lives. Security personnel began receiving offers for better employment elsewhere, carefully crafted to drain Blackwood's organization of competent people. "We're not murderers," Jake said when Emma suggested more direct action against some of Blackwood's enforcers. "We fight monsters, but we don't become them." Emma appreciated the moral distinction, though she sometimes wondered if Jake's restraint might ultimately prove costly. Blackwood had shown no such scruples in his treatment of opponents, and David's death proved he was willing to kill to protect his interests. As their campaign continued, Emma began to notice changes in Jake that went beyond tactical adaptations. The guilt and isolation that had defined him for 20 years were gradually being replaced by purpose and confidence. He moved through their operations with increasing authority, speaking of future plans rather than past regrets. "You're different," Emma observed one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports by lamplight. "Different how?" "More like the men you probably were before the accident. Confident, decisive, forward-looking." Jake considered this for a moment. "Having something worth fighting for changes your perspective. For 20 years, I was just surviving, waiting for time to pass. Now I'm actually living again." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither seemed ready to fully explore. Emma was acutely aware of how their partnership had evolved from necessity to something deeper, more personal. They moved together with increasing synchronization, anticipated each other's thoughts and actions, shared an intimacy born of shared danger and common purpose. But there were barriers too. Jake's memories of Sarah, the wife he'd abandoned 20 years ago. Emma's grief for David, still fresh despite everything that had happened. The uncertainty of what would remain between them once their war against Blackwood concluded. Jake, Emma said carefully, what happens when this is over? When Blackwood is defeated and justice is served? Jake was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames of their small fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful but cautious. I don't know. 20 years ago, I thought I knew what my life would look like. Marriage, family, building things instead of destroying them. That future disappeared when I ran away. But it doesn't have to stay disappeared, Emma said softly. People rebuild their lives all the time. Do they? Or do they just build different lives and tell themselves it's the same thing? Emma couldn't answer that question, either for Jake or for herself. Her own future felt equally uncertain. She couldn't return to her teaching position in Denver. Couldn't pretend that discovering her husband's murder and learning to fight organized crime hadn't fundamentally changed who she was. Maybe the point isn't rebuilding the past, she said finally. Maybe it's creating something new. Jake looked at her across the firelight, and Emma saw something shift in his expression. For a moment, the careful walls he maintained seemed to thin, revealing glimpses of the man underneath. Someone capable of love, of hope, of believing in futures that didn't repeat the mistakes of the past. The moment was interrupted by the radio crackling to life with an emergency transmission. Jake moved quickly to the communications equipment, his expression growing grim as he listened to the intercepted message. What is it? Emma asked. Blackwood's moving the timeline up. He's calling in additional security, accelerating construction, preparing for what sounds like a major operation. Jake's voice was tight with concern. Something's changed. He knows we're still alive. Emma felt ice forming in her stomach. Their carefully planned campaign had been predicated on Blackwood believing they were dead, allowing them to operate, without triggering massive defensive measures. If he knew they were alive and active, everything changed. How, she asked. Unknown. But it doesn't matter now. We have maybe 48 hours before he brings in enough firepower to hunt us down properly. Emma stared at Jake, understanding the implications. They were about to face the full force of Blackwood's organization with nothing but their own skills and determination. The safe house that had seemed so secure suddenly felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Final offensive? She asked. Jake nodded grimly. We take everything we have, every piece of evidence, every tactical advantage, and we hit him with everything at once. Either we destroy his organization completely, or he destroys us. Emma thought of David, of the life she'd lost when she'd chosen to pursue his investigation. She thought of Jake, who had already sacrificed 20 years to Blackwood's manipulations. She thought of all the innocent people who would suffer if they failed. Then we'd better make sure we win, she said. Jake studied her face in the firelight, and Emma saw respect, determination, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite their desperate circumstances. Together, he asked. Together, Emma confirmed. As they began planning their final assault on Richard Blackwood's criminal empire, Emma realized that whatever happened in the next 48 hours would determine not just the outcome of their war, but the shape of whatever future might remain to them. She was no longer the grieving widow who had stumbled into Jake's mountain retreat. She was a warrior, a partner, and possibly something more to the man who had taught her to fight. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of brutal cold that made every breath visible. Jake moved through their final preparations with military precision, checking weapons, reviewing escape routes, and ensuring their communication systems would function under combat conditions. Remember, he said as they prepared to leave the safe house for what might be the last time, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice. We stop Blackwood's organization, we expose his crimes, and we ensure this kind of corruption can't take root here again. Emma nodded, though she had to admit that revenge was very much on her mind. David's death, Jake's exile, the destruction of his cabin, the 20 years of life Blackwood had stolen from both of them. Justice was important, but vengeance had its own appeal. Their target was Blackwood's main compound, the heavily fortified facility they'd observed during their reconnaissance mission. But rather than a direct assault, Jake had devised a strategy that would use Blackwood's own security measures against him. He's expecting us to run, Jake explained as they approached the perimeter of the compound. He's prepared for guerrilla attacks, for sabotage, for everything except a direct confrontation in the middle of his own stronghold. The plan was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. They would infiltrate the compound during a scheduled security briefing when most of Blackwood's key personnel would be gathered in one location. Using explosives and incendiary devices, they would destroy the compound's communication systems, evidence archives, and command facilities while broadcasting live testimony about Blackwood's crimes to news organizations and law enforcement agencies. If we succeed, we cripple his organization and expose everything simultaneously, Jake said. If we fail, we don't fail, Emma said firmly. Jake smiled, and Emma was struck by how much younger he looked when genuine humor reached his eyes. I like your confidence. The infiltration went better than Emma had dared hope. Jake's knowledge of security systems and tactical movement allowed them to penetrate the compound's outer defenses without triggering alarms. They reached the administration building just as Blackwood began his briefing with department heads and security supervisors. Emma positioned herself at the communications center while Jake prepared demolition charges throughout the building. Through surveillance monitors, she could see Blackwood addressing his assembled staff, probably discussing strategies for hunting down the enemies he believed were still alive and active. Ready? Jake's voice crackled through her earpiece. Emma looked at the transmission equipment she'd spent the past hour configuring, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment. David's death, Jake's exile, 20 years of corruption and intimidation, all of it leading to this single point where justice might finally be served. Ready, she confirmed. The explosions began simultaneously throughout the compound, precisely timed to destroy key systems while avoiding areas where non-combatant personnel might be present. Emma activated her transmission equipment and began broadcasting David's evidence to every news organization and law enforcement agency in her database. Through the security monitors, she watched Blackwood's briefing dissolve into chaos as his staff realized they were under attack. The man himself appeared calm at first, probably assuming this was just another piece of sabotage that could be contained and managed. It wasn't until his communications officer informed him that their entire archive of sensitive documents was being broadcast live to the outside world that his composure cracked. Emma. Jake's voice in her earpiece was urgent. Security teams are moving on our position. Time to go. Emma grabbed the portable drives containing backup copies of all their evidence and followed Jake toward their planned escape route. Behind them, the compound erupted in alarms and shouting as Blackwood's organization finally understood the scope of what was happening to them. They almost made it out clean. The escape route Jake had planned took them through sections of the compound that should have been minimally guarded during the security briefing. But Blackwood had anticipated this possibility, positioning reserves to cut off exactly the kind of infiltration they'd attempted. Contact front, Jake called, raising his weapon as armed security personnel appeared at the far end of the corridor they were traversing. Emma found herself moving with trained instincts that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, taking cover and returning fire with the compact pistol Jake had taught her to use. The enclosed space made accurate shooting difficult, but it also limited their enemy's ability to maneuver. This way, Jake directed, leading her toward an alternative exit he'd identified during their planning. They fought their way through 2 more security checkpoints, Jake's military training and Emma's newfound competence combining to overcome superior numbers through superior tactics and determination. But as they approached the compound's perimeter, Emma realized they weren't going to escape without paying a price. Jake stumbled as they crossed the final stretch of open ground, blood spreading across his left shoulder where a security guard's bullet had found its mark. Emma helped support his weight as they reached the tree line, adrenaline and desperation giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. How bad? She asked as they took shelter behind a fallen log. Jake examined the wound with professional detachment. Not fatal, but it needs attention, and it's going to slow us down. Behind them, the compound was fully alert now, search teams beginning to spread out into the surrounding forest. Emma could hear dogs barking, indicating that Blackwood had capabilities they hadn't anticipated. Can you make it to the extraction point? Emma asked. Jake nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him. Just need to stay ahead of the pursuit long enough to reach the vehicles. They had cached supplies and transportation at several locations around the compound, anticipating the need for rapid escape under combat conditions. The nearest cache was 2 miles through difficult terrain, a challenging hike even without injury and pursuit. As they began moving through the forest, Emma found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they'd accomplished. By now, David's evidence was spreading across news networks and law enforcement databases throughout the country. Blackwood's criminal organization was being exposed in real time, his carefully constructed network of corruption and intimidation unraveling as authorities finally had the evidence they needed to act. "We did it," she said as they paused to rest and check Jake's wound. "Phase 1, Jake corrected, though he seemed pleased by their success. "Exposing Blackwood is just the beginning. Making sure justice actually gets served, that's going to take sustained pressure from outside authorities." Emma nodded, understanding that their war wasn't truly over just because they destroyed Blackwood's compound and exposed his crimes. Powerful men had ways of escaping consequences, of shifting blame and avoiding accountability. But they'd struck a blow that would be difficult to recover from. They reached the extraction point as pursuit teams began closing in from multiple directions. Jake's cached vehicle started immediately, and Emma felt a surge of relief as they pulled away from the compound with evidence of Blackwood's crimes safely in their possession. "Where to now?" Emma asked as Jake navigated back roads that would keep them away from potential checkpoints. "Safe house first, medical attention for this shoulder. Then we disappear until we know how the authorities are going to respond," Jake replied. "After that." He glanced at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "After that, we figure out what comes next." Emma settled back in the passenger seat, exhaustion finally beginning to overcome adrenaline. They had fought their war and achieved something resembling victory. Blackwood's organization was exposed and crippled. Justice was finally being served for David's murder and countless other crimes, and she and Jake had survived to see their mission completed. But Jake was right. What came next was an entirely different question, one that would determine whether their partnership had been forged by necessity alone or represented something deeper and more lasting. As they drove through the Colorado mountains toward an uncertain future, Emma found herself hoping that the man who had whispered, "I've been alone 20 years until you," in moments of vulnerability, might be ready to discover what 21 years of companionship could offer. 3 months later, Emma stood in the sunshine outside the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as Richard Blackwood was led away in handcuffs after his conviction on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. The evidence she and Jake had gathered, combined with testimony from witnesses who had finally felt safe enough to come forward, had proven overwhelming. Jake stood beside her, his shoulder fully healed and his expression satisfied rather than vindictive. The man who had spent 20 years in exile was slowly readjusting to civilization, though Emma suspected he would always prefer mountains to cities. "Justice served," Emma said, watching Blackwood disappear into a prison transport vehicle. "Justice served," Jake agreed. "And other people are safe from his kind of corruption." They walked away from the courthouse together, past reporters and legal observers who were already moving on to other stories. The media attention had been intense for several weeks, but public interest was fading as new scandals captured headlines. "What now?" Emma asked as they reached Jake's truck, the same question that had been hanging between them for months. Jake turned to face her, and Emma saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken with hope and nervousness in equal measure. "I've been thinking about that schoolhouse design," he said quietly. "The one I drew in my cabin. There's good land available now that Blackwood's development plans have collapsed. Land where children could learn in clean air with mountain views." Emma felt her heart skip as she understood what he was offering. Not just a building project, but a shared future. A chance to create something positive from the destruction they'd witnessed and caused. "You'd want a partner in that kind of project?" she asked carefully. Jake's smile was the most beautiful thing Emma had ever seen. "I've been alone 20 years until you," he said, echoing words he'd whispered in vulnerable moments during their most dangerous operations. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Emma thought of David, of the life she'd lost when she'd chosen to pursue justice for his murder. She thought of the woman she'd been before meeting Jake, safe and conventional, and ultimately unfulfilled. She thought of the woman she'd become, someone capable of fighting for what mattered and building something meaningful from struggle and sacrifice. Neither do I, she said, and stepped into Jake's arms with the certainty that whatever they built together would be worth every risk they'd taken to reach this moment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.